Snow White. In the midst of a winter so profound and unrelenting that the very air seemed frozen in place, snowflakes descended from the heavens like soft feathers plucked from some ethereal bird, blanketing the world in a hush of white. Within the stone walls of a grand castle, a queen sat by a window, her slender fingers guiding a needle through a piece of fine linen embroidery. The window's frame was crafted of ebony wood, as black and glossy as the midnight sky, its dark hue contrasting sharply with the pallor of the snow outside. The room itself was a chamber of quiet opulence, with tapestries depicting ancient hunts and flickering candles casting long shadows across the flagstone floor. The queen, her face serene yet touched by a subtle melancholy, gazed out at the falling snow, her thoughts drifting like the flakes themselves. As she worked the needle with practiced grace, it slipped, ever so slightly, pricking her finger. 3 drops of blood welled up and fell upon the snow below the open window, their vivid red staining the pristine white in a pattern that was both beautiful and poignant. She paused, her breath misting the cold glass, and whispered to herself, "Would that I had a child as white as this pure snow, as red as this fresh blood, and as black as the ebony of this window frame." Her heartfelt wish, uttered in the solitude of that wintry afternoon, was soon granted by the inscrutable forces of fate. Not long after she gave birth to a little daughter, whose skin was as white as the winter's snow, whose lips were as red as the blood that had fallen, and whose hair was as black as the ebony frame that had inspired her mother's longing. The child was named Snow White, a name that captured the essence of that fateful moment. Yet, the joy of birth was marred by tragedy, for the queen, weakened by the labor, slipped away into eternal rest, her life extinguished like a candle in the wind. The king, her husband, was left to grieve in the echoing halls of the castle, his heart heavy with loss as he cradled the infant, who so resembled her mother. A full year passed, marked by seasons that seemed to blur in the king's sorrow, before he took another wife. This new queen was a woman of extraordinary beauty, her features chiseled as if by a master sculptor, her skin flawless, and her eyes a piercing shade of emerald that could ensnare the soul. But beneath this outward perfection lay a heart steeped in pride and haughtiness, a spirit that brooked no rival in matters of beauty. She could not endure the thought that any other might surpass her in loveliness, and this obsession consumed her days. In her private chambers, adorned with mirrors and silken drapes, hung a wonderful looking-glass, its surface enchanted by some ancient sorcery to speak only the unvarnished truth. Each morning as the first light filtered through the heavy curtains, she would stand before it, her robe of velvet trailing behind her, and intone in a voice laced with command, looking-glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And the glass, its voice echoing with an otherworldly clarity, would reply, "Thou, O Queen, art the fairest of all." Satisfied, she would smile, a curve of her lips that held more triumph than warmth, knowing the mirror could not lie. This ritual became her anchor, a daily affirmation of her supremacy. But Snow White grew, her beauty unfolding gradually like a flower in the spring thaw. From a babe in swaddling clothes she became a child of remarkable grace, her skin remaining as white as snow, her lips as red as blood, her hair as black as ebony. By the time she reached her 7th year, she was as beautiful as the brightest day, her presence illuminating the castle corridors with an innocent radiance that drew admiring glances from all who saw her. Even the servants whispered of her loveliness, comparing her favorably to the flowers in the royal gardens, or the stars in the night sky. One fateful day, the queen, sensing a shift in the air, a subtle undercurrent of comparison among the courtiers, returned to her looking-glass. She stood there, her posture rigid, her heart pounding with an unspoken dread, and asked once more, looking-glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" The glass, faithful to its enchantment, answered without hesitation, "Thou art fairer than all who are here, Lady Queen, but more beautiful still is Snow White, as I ween." The words hung in the air like a curse, striking the queen with the force of a physical blow. Her face contorted, her cheeks draining of color to a ghastly yellow, then flushing green with the bile of envy. From that hour forward, whenever her eyes fell upon Snow White, playing in the gardens, her laughter tinkling like bells, or simply passing through the halls with her ebony hair swaying, she felt her heart heave in her breast, a surge of hatred so intense it robbed her of breath. "How can this child, this remnant of the old queen, eclipse me?" she muttered to herself in the dead of night, her fingers clenching the silken sheets. Envy and pride grew within her like a pernicious weed, twisting and spreading until they choked every moment of peace, day and night alike. Sleep eluded her, meals turned to ash in her mouth, and her thoughts circled endlessly around the girl who threatened her throne of beauty. Unable to bear the torment any longer, the queen summoned a huntsman from the royal guard, a man of sturdy build and weathered features, his eyes hardened by years in the wild. She received him in her chamber, the air thick with the scent of incense and intrigue. "Take the child Snow White away into the forest," she commanded, her voice low and venomous, her emerald eyes boring into his. "I will no longer have her in my sight. Kill her there, where no one will witness, and bring me back her heart, as a token of your deed." The huntsman, though loyal, felt a twinge of unease at the order, but he bowed and obeyed, leading the unsuspecting Snow White into the depths of the wild forest. The woods were a labyrinth of ancient trees, their trunks twisted like old men's spines, branches interlacing overhead to form a canopy that blocked out much of the sun. The ground was carpeted with fallen leaves and moss, the air filled with the calls of birds and the distant howl of wolves. As they ventured deeper, the huntsman drew his knife, its blade sharp and gleaming in the dappled light, preparing to pierce Snow White's innocent heart. But the child, sensing the shift in his demeanor, began to weep, her tears streaming down her white cheeks. "Ah, dear huntsman," she sobbed, her voice breaking with fear, "leave me my life. I beg you, have mercy. I will run away into this wild forest and never come home again. Please, I am but a child. Spare me." Her words, coupled with her beauty, so pure, so vulnerable, stirred a deep pity in the huntsman's heart. He lowered the knife, his hand trembling. "Run away then, you poor child," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Flee as far as you can." In his mind he thought, "The wild beasts will soon devour you in this unforgiving place." Yet it felt as though a great stone had been rolled from his heart, for he could not bring himself to kill her. Just then a young boar came crashing through the underbrush, its eyes wild and tusks sharp. Seizing the opportunity, the huntsman stabbed it, cut out its heart, and carried the bloody organ back to the queen, as proof that the deed was done. She, in her wicked delusion, ordered the cook to salt and prepare it. That night she ate it with a savage satisfaction, believing it to be Snow White's heart, the taste bitter yet triumphant on her tongue. Now the poor child was utterly alone in the great forest, the trees closing in around her like silent guardians or foes, she could not tell which. Terror gripped her, and she looked at every leaf fluttering on every tree, every shadow shifting on the ground, expecting danger at every turn. "What shall I do?" she whispered to herself, her voice small amid the rustling foliage. "Where can I go?" She began to run, her small feet pounding against the earth, stumbling over sharp stones that cut her soles, tearing through thickets of thorns that scratched her arms and legs, drawing blood that stained her dress. The wild beasts of the forest, deer bounding gracefully, foxes slinking in the shadows, even a pack of wolves with glowing eyes, ran past her, but miraculously, they did her no harm, as if some invisible hand protected her. "Why do they spare me?" she wondered between gasps, her heart racing, her breath coming in ragged bursts. The forest seemed endless, a maze of green and brown, filled with the scents of pine and damp earth, the sounds of birdsong, and distant streams. She ran as long as her feet would carry her, until the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the path. It was almost evening when she spotted a little cottage nestled in a clearing, its thatched roof covered in moss, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. The structure was quaint and small, its walls made of rough-hewn logs, windows glowing with a warm light that beckoned her forward. Exhausted and desperate, she approached and pushed open the door, finding herself in a room that was neat and clean beyond description. A table stood in the center, covered with a white cloth as spotless as fresh snow, upon which were 7 little plates, each with a tiny spoon beside it. Nearby were 7 little knives and forks, and 7 little mugs filled with what smelled like ale or wine. Against one wall stood 7 little beds, side by side, each covered with a snow-white counterpane, their pillows plump and inviting. Little Snow White, her stomach growling with hunger and her throat parched with thirst, could not resist. "I must be careful not to take too much from anyone," she murmured to herself, her voice echoing softly in the empty room. She ate some vegetables and a bit of bread from each plate, savoring the simple flavors: crisp carrots, earthy potatoes, fresh loaves that were still warm. From each mug, she drank a single drop of wine, its tartness refreshing her. Then, overcome by fatigue, she tried the beds one by one. The first was too long, her feet dangling off the end. The second, too short, her knees curled uncomfortably. The third was lumpy. The fourth sagged in the middle. The fifth was too hard. The sixth too soft. But the seventh was just right, its mattress yielding perfectly to her small frame. She lay down upon it, said a quiet prayer for protection, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When the darkness of night had fully enveloped the forest, the owners of the cottage returned home. They were 7 dwarfs, hardy folk, who spent their days digging and delving in the mountains for ore, their backs bent from labor, their beards long and tangled. Each carried a lantern, and as they entered, they lit 7 candles on the table, illuminating the room with a soft flickering glow. Immediately they noticed that all was not as they had left it, their keen eyes spotting the subtle disturbances. The first dwarf, the eldest with a beard streaked in grey, frowned and said, "Who has been sitting on my chair?" He examined the seat, noting how it was slightly askew, the cushion indented. The second, a burly fellow with a voice like gravel, added, "Who has been eating off my plate?" He pointed to the crumbs and the missing bites. The third, lean and quick-eyed, chimed in, "Who has been taking some of my bread?" His loaf was noticeably diminished. The fourth, with a round face and a jolly demeanor under normal circumstances, said, "Who has been eating my vegetables?" His pile of greens was uneven. The fifth, meticulous and precise, held up his utensil. "Who has been using my fork?" The tines bore faint marks of use. The sixth, the craftsman among them, inspected his tool. "Who has been cutting with my knife?" The blade showed fresh scratches. The seventh, the youngest with a curious spark in his eyes, exclaimed, "Who has been drinking out of my mug?" The level of wine was lower than he remembered. Then the first dwarf glanced at his bed, and saw a small hollow in the counterpane. "Who has been getting into my bed?" he declared, his voice rising in alarm. The others hurried over, each inspecting their own and calling out in turn, "Somebody has been lying in my bed too." But the seventh, approaching his with caution, peered under the covers, and saw little Snow White lying asleep therein, her chest rising and falling gently. "Brothers, come quickly," he called, his tone a mix of astonishment and delight. They all gathered around, holding their candles high, the light falling upon her lovely face, highlighting her white skin, red lips and black hair. "Oh heavens! Oh heavens!" they cried in unison, their voices a chorus of wonder. "What a lovely child she is!" They were so glad and enchanted by her presence, that they did not wake her, but let her continue sleeping peacefully. The seventh dwarf, to accommodate the arrangement, slept with his companions, 1 hour with each, and thus they passed the night in shifts. When morning broke, the sun filtering through the cottage windows in golden rays, little Snow White awoke. She was frightened at first, seeing the 7 dwarfs standing around her bed, their beards and weathered faces staring down at her. But they were friendly, their eyes kind and welcoming, and they asked in gentle tones, "What is your name, little one?" "My name is Snow White," she answered, her voice soft and steady despite her fear. "How have you come to our house?" asked the first dwarf, leaning on his pickaxe, his grey beard twitching with curiosity. She told them her story, her words tumbling out in a rush: the queen's hatred, the huntsman's mercy, her flight through the thorn-filled forest. "I ran until I could run no more," she said, her eyes welling with tears. The stones cut my feet, the thorns tore my clothes, but I found your cottage and hoped for shelter." The dwarves listened attentively, their hearts moved by her tale. "If you will take care of our house," said the second, his gruff voice softened, "cook our meals, make the beds, wash our clothes, sew and knit when needed, and keep everything neat and clean, you can stay with us, and you shall want for nothing." "Yes," said Snow White, her face brightening, "with all my heart, I will do all that and more to repay your kindness." And so she stayed with them. She kept the house in perfect order. In the mornings, the dwarves would set out for the mountains, their tools slung over their shoulders, searching for copper and gold in the deep mines, the echo of their picks ringing through the tunnels. In the evenings they returned, weary but cheerful, and their supper would be ready, steaming and savory. The girl was alone the whole day, tending to chores, sweeping the floors until they gleamed, washing the tiny dishes with care, mending their worn clothes with neat stitches. But the good dwarves warned her repeatedly, their voices serious, as they gathered around the table at night. "Beware of your stepmother," said the third, his lean frame leaning forward. "She will soon know that you are here. She has ways of finding out. Be sure to let no one come in while we are away." Back at the castle, the queen, believing she had consumed Snow White's heart and secured her position, felt a renewed confidence. She approached her looking-glass one evening, the room dim with twilight, and said, "Looking-glass, looking-glass, on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" The glass answered, "O Queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills, where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she." The Queen was astounded, her face paling as the truth sank in. She knew the looking-glass never spoke falsely, and the realization that the huntsman had betrayed her, that Snow White still lived, ignited a fire of rage within her. "How can this be?" she cried, slamming her fist against the mirror's frame. "I ate her heart, she should be dead. Envy let her have no rest, her nights filled with pacing and plotting, her days shadowed by the girl's phantom presence." She thought and thought, her mind a whirlwind of dark schemes, until she devised a plan. In a hidden alcove of her chamber she painted her face with cosmetics to age her appearance, dressed herself like an old peddler woman, her elegant gown replaced by rags and a cloak that hid her figure. No one would recognize her in this disguise. With a basket of wares she set out over the 7 mountains, the path winding through misty valleys and steep slopes, until she reached the dwarf's cottage. She knocked at the door and cried in a quavering voice, "Pretty things to sell, very cheap, very cheap." Little Snow White, curious despite the warnings, looked out of the window. "Good day, my good woman," she called. "What have you to sell?" "Good things, pretty things," the disguised queen answered, her voice cracked and aged. "Stay laces of all colors," and she pulled out one woven of bright-colored silk, holding it up so it caught the light. "I may let the worthy old woman in," thought Snow White, her innocence overriding caution, and she unbolted the door, buying the pretty laces. "Child," said the old woman, her eyes gleaming slyly, "what a fright you look in that loose gown. Come, I will lace you properly for once." Snow White had no suspicion, standing before her, and allowing the laces to be threaded. But the old woman laced so quickly and so tightly that Snow White lost her breath, her vision darkening, and she fell down as if dead. "Now I am the most beautiful," said the queen to herself, a cruel smile twisting her lips, and she ran away, her heart pounding with exhilaration. Not long afterward, as the sun set and the forest grew dark, the 7 dwarfs came home. How shocked they were when they saw their dear little Snow White lying on the ground, neither stirring nor moving, seeming lifeless. "What has befallen her?" cried the first, his voice cracking with worry. They lifted her up, and as they saw that she was laced too tightly, the second dwarf cut the laces with his knife. Then she began to breathe a little, her chest rising slowly, and after a while, she came to life again. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said in unison, "The old peddler woman was no one else than the wicked queen. Take care and let no one come in when we are not with you." But the wicked woman, upon reaching home, went in front of the glass and asked, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And it answered as before, O Queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills, where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she. When she heard that, all her blood rushed to her heart with fear, for she saw plainly that little Snow White was again alive. But now, she said, her voice a snarl in the empty room, I will think of something that shall put an end to you once and for all. Drawing upon her knowledge of witchcraft, she made a poisonous comb in her secret room, the air thick with acrid fumes from bubbling potions. Then she disguised herself as another old woman, her features altered with spells and makeup. So she went over the 7 mountains again, the journey arduous under the weight of her hatred, knocked at the door, and cried, Good things to sell, cheap, cheap. Little Snow White looked out and said, Go away, I cannot let anyone come in. I suppose you can look, said the old woman, pulling the poisonous comb out and holding it up, its teeth glistening ominously. It pleased the girl so well, its design intricate and beautiful, that she let herself be beguiled and opened the door. When they had made a bargain, the old woman said, Now I will comb you properly for once, my dear. Poor little Snow White, still trusting, let the old woman do as she pleased, but hardly had the comb touched her hair than the poison took effect, and the girl fell down senseless. You paragon of beauty, said the wicked woman, her laugh a low cackle, you are done for now. And she departed, her cloak swirling behind her. But fortunately, it was almost evening, and the 7 dwarfs soon came home. When they saw Snow White lying as if dead upon the ground, they at once suspected the stepmother. Search her, said the 3rd, his quick eyes darting. They looked and found the poisoned comb embedded in her hair. Scarcely had they taken it out when Snow White came to herself, gasping for air, and told them what had happened. She came again, disguised differently, she said, her voice weak. Then they warned her once more to be upon her guard, and to open the door to no one. Promise us, pleaded the 4th, his round face etched with concern. The Queen at home went in front of the glass and said, Looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all? Then it answered as before, O Queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills, where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she. When she heard the glass speak thus, she trembled and shook with rage, her fists clenched until her nails dug into her palms. Snow White shall die, she cried, her voice echoing through the chamber, even if it costs me my life. Thereupon she retreated to her most secret lonely room, a hidden vault beneath the castle where no one ever ventured, the walls damp and lined with shelves of arcane ingredients. There, by the light of a single torch, she made a very poisonous apple. Outside it looked pretty, white with a red cheek that glowed like a ruby, so tempting that anyone who saw it would long for it. But whoever ate even a piece of it must surely die. She mixed the poison with care, whispering incantations over the bubbling cauldron, the fumes making her eyes water. When the apple was ready, she painted her face once more and dressed herself up as a countrywoman, her attire simple and rustic, a kerchief tied around her head. So she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs, the path now familiar in her obsession. She knocked at the door. Snow White put her head out of the window and said, I cannot let anyone in, the 7 dwarfs have forbidden me. It is all the same to me, answered the woman, her voice hearty and reassuring. I shall soon get rid of my apples. There, I will give you one as a gift. No, said Snow White, her resolve wavering slightly, I dare not take anything. Are you afraid of poison? Said the old woman, chuckling softly. Look, I will cut the apple in 2 pieces, you eat the red cheek, and I will eat the white. The apple was so cunningly made that only the red cheek was poisoned. Snow White longed for the fine apple, its aroma sweet and inviting, and when she saw that the woman ate part of it without harm, she could resist no longer. She stretched out her hand and took the poisonous half. But hardly had she a bit of it in her mouth than the poison coursed through her veins, and she fell down dead upon the floor. Then the Queen looked at her with a dreadful look, her eyes blazing with victory, and laughed aloud. "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony wood," she exclaimed. "This time the dwarfs cannot wake you up again." And when she returned home and asked of the looking-glass, "Looking glass, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" it answered at last, "O Queen, in this land thou art fairest of all." Then her envious heart had rest, so far as an envious heart can have rest, a fragile peace amid the storm of her soul. The dwarfs, when they came home in the evening, their lanterns bobbing in the dark, found Snow White lying upon the ground. She breathed no longer, and was dead. They lifted her up, their hands gentle despite their calluses, and looked to see whether they could find anything poisonous. They unlaced her gown, combed her ebony hair with care, washed her face with water and wine, but it was all of no use. The poor child was dead, and remained dead. They laid her upon a bier in the center of the room, and all 7 of them sat round it, weeping for her, their tears falling like rain. And they wept 3 days long, their sobs filling the cottage. Then they prepared to bury her, but she still looked as if she were living, her pretty red cheeks unchanged, her skin as white as ever. "We could not bury her in the dark ground," said the first dwarf, his voice choked with emotion. "She is too beautiful for the earth to claim." So they had a transparent coffin of glass, made by a skilled craftsman in the mountains, so that she could be seen from all sides, and they laid her in it, writing her name upon it in golden letters, and that she was a king's daughter. Then they put the coffin out upon the mountain, amid the wild flowers and rocks, and one of them always stayed by it and watched over her, taking turns in their vigil. And birds came too, drawn by some instinct, and wept for Snow White, first an owl with its mournful hoot, then a raven croaking sorrowfully, and last a dove cooing softly in lament. And now Snow White lay a long, long time in the coffin, preserved by some mysterious enchantment, and she did not change, but looked as if she were merely asleep, for she was still as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair as black as ebony. It happened, however, that a king's son, a young prince from a neighboring realm, came wandering into the forest on a hunt, his horse weary, and his companions scattered. Seeking shelter for the night, he came upon the dwarfs' house, its lights twinkling invitingly. The dwarfs welcomed him, sharing their simple meal, and as he rested, he noticed the glass coffin on the mountain slope nearby. Curious, he approached it, seeing the beautiful Snow White within, her form serene and eternal. He read what was written upon it in golden letters, and felt his heart stir with an inexplicable longing. "Let me have the coffin," he said to the dwarfs, his voice earnest. "I will give you whatever you want for it, gold, jewels, lands." But the dwarfs answered, shaking their heads, "We will not part with it for all the gold in the world. She is our charge, our dear one." Then he pleaded further, "Let me have it as a gift, for I cannot live without seeing Snow White. I will honor and prize her as my dearest possession, guarding her with my life." As he spoke in this way, his eyes filled with genuine emotion, the good dwarfs took pity upon him, their hearts softened by his sincerity, and gave him the coffin. And now the king's son had it carried away by his servants on their shoulders, the procession winding through the forest paths. And it happened that they stumbled over a tree stump hidden in the undergrowth, and with the shock, the poisonous piece of apple which Snow White had bitten off came dislodged from her throat. And before long she opened her eyes, lifted up the lid of the coffin with a gasp, sat up, and was once more alive. "Oh heavens, where am I?" she cried, her voice hoarse from disuse, her eyes wide with confusion. The king's son, full of joy, knelt beside her and said, "You are with me, safe now." He told her what had happened, the dwarfs' care, his discovery, and added, "I love you more than everything in the world. Come with me to my father's palace, you shall be my wife." And Snow White, her heart touched by his kindness and the miracle of her revival, was willing, and went with him. Their wedding was held with great show and splendor, the castle halls filled with music, feasts, and guests, from far and wide. But Snow White's wicked stepmother was also bidden to the feast, invited, as a matter of courtly protocol, unaware of the bride's true identity. When she had arrayed herself in her finest clothes, silks and jewels that shimmered like stars, she went before the looking-glass one last time, her vanity demanding confirmation. Looking-glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all? The glass answered, O Queen of all, here the fairest art thou, but the young Queen is fairer by far, as I trow. Then the wicked woman uttered a curse, her face contorting in horror, and was so wretched, so utterly wretched, that she knew not what to do. It cannot be her, she whispered, her hands shaking. At first, she would not go to the wedding at all, pacing her chamber in agony, but she had no peace, her envy compelling her to see the young Queen for herself. And when she arrived and went in, she knew Snow White immediately. The girl's beauty shone like a beacon amid the crowd. She stood still with rage and fear, unable to stir, her body frozen as if by ice. But the punishment was swift. Iron slippers had already been put upon the fire in the great hall, heated to a glowing red. They were brought in with tongs by silent attendants, and set before her. Then she was forced to put on the red-hot shoes, the metal searing her flesh, and dance in torment, her screams piercing the festive air, until she dropped down dead, her body collapsing in a heap, her envious heart stilled at last.